All right. Well, welcome everyone. Thank you all for being here. My name is Anjali Fallberg. I am the chair of the communications team for the Peace, War, and Social Conflict section and assistant professor in the Department of Sociology at Tufts University. And we have two speakers today who are going to be talking about a very, very important, timely topic. So we have Ori Swed, who is the current chair of the PWSC section. He's an assistant professor in the Department of Sociology, Anthropology, and Social Work at Texas Tech University, and also the director of the Peace, War, and Social Conflict Laboratory. And we also have Lisa Hajjar, who was our former chair of PWSC section and is a professor and department chair of the Department of Sociology at UC Santa Barbara. So I'm going to hand it over to you two. They're each going to speak for, I think, about 10-ish minutes, and then we will spend the rest of the time just opening it up for conversation and questions. So take it away.
Hey, hello, everyone. Thank you for coming, and thank you for this opportunity to have that discussion. Anjali, you're amazing. You're doing a lot of things, and we all appreciate that. And this is part of this kind of amazing engagement that we produce in the section. Before I'll begin, expect soon an announcement on a call for submission for ASA and a reminder of the award. So just putting it out there. Okay, so today we're going to talk a bit about what sociology can bring into the discussion on the Israel-Gaza conflict. And we shared with you two manuscripts. And my conversation with Lisa, I was telling her that actually those two manuscripts, though amazing, they're not a great example of how sociology can contribute to the discussion. It's more about public engagement on the topic. So what I'm going to do is that I'm going to talk a bit more about what sociology can contribute. I will talk briefly about my work, and throughout I will refer to my interpretation and impression of Lisa's work. And yeah, that's about it, 10 minutes approximately, and then go to Lisa. So the first thing is that the reason I find the study of conflict areas so interesting, compelling, and from sociological point of view, is that sociological dynamics behave differently. Things are different. It does not operate the same as in peacetime field. Things are more fluid. Power behaves differently. There is reshuffling of power. The moment that we have actors that introduce ability to use coercive violence into a setting, and that they can come from so many different directions, they reshape and renegotiate the setting. And through that, everything keeps on changing and shifting, and it's so bewildering and interesting. One of my approaches to that is that I try to bring functionalism using organizational studies or sociology of law to understand how organizations and legal framework try to create order in that chaos. And I use critical approach to try to figure out where everything does not go as planned. But above all that, because of the fact that it's not just an intellectual engagement, it's also serious events that affecting people's lives dramatically. I bring a lot of pragmatism, pragmatist approach, American pragmatism, in terms of what can be done to reduce harm, what can be done to deal with a threat, what can be done in terms of pragmatism, what is working, what is not working, given the limitation, the circumstance. Now, there are few ground rules when you study armed conflict. One, for the most part, you don't have good guys, bad guys. Any attempt to look at dichotomy, saying, well, this is the people that we are with, those are the people that we're against, we have oppressor and victim, perpetrator, they don't make sense. They are good political tools, good discursive tool, but they really don't represent reality on the ground. You can have a perpetrator that abuse women and children, and a minute later that he's a victim of oppression prior, and then he become a victim again when he's arrested. So how do we even understand that sort of dynamic? Another thing is that there is this famous saying that the first casualty of war is the truth. Everyone lies, everyone frames their messages, and we need to be very careful when we try to understand what the hell is happening in those settings. We see in American politics how on specific issues the framing and the messaging are so powerful, and they shape a false dichotomy. Well, actually, things are way more complicated because someone tried to win an argument that will get them in power or will win them money or something. In conflict areas, those narratives are recruited for people to be able to actually survive, to be able to actually live or die. So the stakes are significantly higher. Now, at the same time, despite the fact that everyone lies and everyone frames, there are things that do happen, and people do say that this atrocity happened, this horrible thing happened, this oppression happened. So it creates this mixture that generates a lot of confusion. For me, when I was going through Lisa's work, I had to push back on some of the claims because I did not find enough proof for some of the claims on genocide, claim on open air prison. There are I'm not saying something is everything is fine or dandy or something like that, but for me there is a lot of variation, and there is a need for higher level of proof to show things. Now, let's have this experiment. If you will Google Israel-Hezbollah war 2023 on Wikipedia and try to see how many people died, and it's going on now and it's reported constantly, and you look at the English version, you'll get some numbers. You look at the Russian version, you get different numbers. You look at the Arabic version, you get different numbers. Farsi version, completely different. So everyone creates their own narrative, and in that case, the politicization of casualties, the politicization of who is actually was harmed or dead or victim of those exchange is fluid, and that creates a massive challenge. I mean, this is maybe the most kind of basic thing to know who's the victim, how many people die. Many times we cannot answer those questions because of the challenges that setting introduced to us. Now, putting those things aside, when I was in graduate school, and when I thought that I'm going to do my work primarily on the Israel-Palestinian conflict before I figure out how contentious it is in American academia, I came up with this point of view prism. Call it historical contingency, saying that what we see with the Israel-Palestinian conflict is an unfolding historical event. And many times the way that we interpret it is the way that we think how it will end or should end. So if it will end as one state, looking back, what we see here is one side oppressing the other, and unfairly, eventually it would be we're all the same, it's one nation. Now, if we're talking about two-state solution, then the interpretation is different, because we see a painful and ugly separation between two political bodies, between two national movements. Now, our imagination of the future solution affect the way that we interpret things now. Again, when I was looking at Lisa's work, I saw that you invoked the Cambodian killing field. That is a case of a government abusing its own population. I understand that conflict more is civil war that will lead, hopefully, for a separation. which in that context, it's parallel conversation. They don't meet. So what sociology can do in study of that sort of phenomena? I think that the most clear and urgent kind of discussion that we can have is the sociology of knowledge. How do we know what we know? What is real? What is accurate? How people produce fake? Why do they produce that fake? How do they weaponize messages? There are several projects that conflict pushed us in the lab to start producing. One of them explore social media fakes by pro-Palestinian, pro-Israel, and we try to understand what they're trying to do. Preliminary results says that essentially each side try to show that the other they lose the moral high ground. Essentially, it's a battle on the moral high ground. Who has it? Who's not? There are questions that related to organization. How organization operate and function in those settings? How do they respond to things? How do they behave in that sort of setting? We can look at civil society organization, official UN organization, Hamas as a political group and organization, Israeli military organization. One of the projects that we run in the lab now is on Hamas research and development project of missiles and bombs and drones and whatever. Aid and relief and development approach, looking at how it is distributed, what are the challenges. There is that body of work on rebel rule, looking at how non-state actors govern and what does it mean, because we're talking about non-state that behave like a state. Discussion on memory, how people address trauma and create memory for events while they actually happening. Gender questions on areas where conflict is happening and where gender roles might be shift or change or might experience new type of stressors and challenges. Law, sociology of law, and what is legal, what is not legal, how we conceptualize those things. I'm sure that Lisa will be able to contribute to that way more than I do. Now, in terms of my paper, really briefly, essentially I decided to focus on the October 7 atrocities because of the sociology of knowledge, because I figured out that there are so many stories, so many things that are not clear, and I tried to figure out why there is that denialism, why there is that, and it all started with forensic science. And in that study, I just explored the forensic science process, highlighting the complexities of getting clear-cut proof in that sort of situation. Now, beyond that, that specific event is very pivotal. It changed everything. Now, I think that many times when we, not many times, what's happening now is that when we look at the current conflict, we look at that in light of the 4 past wars in Gaza. But it's something else. I would gladly elaborate on that after in the discussion if you have questions, and I would gladly elaborate on what we can expect next to see what will happen there and what is actually happening now in terms of what the military is trying to achieve, what Israel is trying to achieve, and other questions of that sort. And with that, I give the stage to Lisa.
Great. Thank you so much, Ori. And thanks to everybody for coming. I see 2 of my students are here, Samuel Liu and Sloan Druni, excuse me. So, you know, I mean, one of the things, like I really began my academic career working on Israel-Palestine. My dissertation was on the Israeli military courts in the West Bank and Gaza. And it was through that kind of research that I got to understand much more, issues relating to law and occupation, et cetera, but also coming to understand sort of at a very grounded way the politics of Israel's occupation of the West Bank and Gaza, and sort of following these evolving developments over the decades. So one thing, it kind of turned me into a sociologist of law and a sociologist of human rights, but one in which I focus very much on issues of political conflict and violence. And so one of the things that, just as a sociologist of law, as opposed to being a lawyer, I like to understand law, particularly international laws, as something that is very rich for sociologists to understand, sort of as frames, as points of reference, as lenses to judge the world. And this is what I even teach my undergraduates, is that the law shouldn't be regarded in the way that necessarily lawyers try to monopolize it, as something that we non-lawyers must hold back and see what the authoritative interpretations are, particularly around issues of international law and law enforcement, human rights laws, and international humanitarian laws that govern war and armed conflict. It's, they're available to us. And the thing that I find, so useful and particularly relevant in the context of what's happening, sort of Israel's war on Gaza now, is that we can see, we can consider what international laws have to say and look at what's actually happening on the ground. And I would take a little bit of issue with what Ori said, is that we can't really know. I mean, there has been so much information has been coming out, even as, there's vast amounts of things that we don't know. But we can see, for example, what's happening, and then we can using law, we can judge it. The use of disproportionate force, the use of non-discriminating weapons. These are, indisputably occurring in Gaza, and those are in and of themselves war crimes. I mean, you don't need to be an international lawyer to assess that. The deliberate targeting of civilians, which has created really an incredible toll of human life, and the ethnic cleansing that has occurred, sort of pushing the population of Gaza to the south. Those are crimes against humanity that are occurring in the context of Gaza. So one point about that is just to, be able to think about the world. And I find, and I try to convey to my students, this idea that law gives us something that we can think about and use to understand what is happening, and to as moral and principled citizens of the world, to make some kinds of informed assessments. So that's one thing where I think that sociology has a lot to offer for understanding these kind of the horrors of October 7th, the atrocities that Hamas perpetrated. Those are crimes against humanity and war crimes as well. So one of the things that I find, I've been very active since, the start of this war with fellow, my colleagues and students on this campus, on the campus of University of California, Santa Barbara, and just sort of keeping, a pace, and just my own sort of obsessive, consumption of news. But one of the things that many people, who are not sort of deeply, immersed in issues relating to Palestine and Israel are just asking is, how is this happening? How is the unprecedented levels of violence and human suffering going on without something being done to halt and stop it? I mean, I think there were a lot of eyes, my own included, on the South African case in the International Court of Justice. But that's, in a sense, what the ICJ does, and what will ever come out of that, we don't know what will come out of that, is it will sort of establish certain kind of facts, as Ori was mentioning, but it will also establish, it raises the question of what norms are going to continue to, are international legal norms going to survive, or are they going to be, altered or damaged as a result of what does and doesn't happen in the coming weeks and months? And so one thing, so from my vantage point, in terms of as a sociologist, there's several paradigms that I sort of utilize. Like one of them is, and I really developed this in the context of being a student of the US War on Terror, and the US War on Terror has very closely approximated and often intersected with Israel's national security approaches over the decades. And I sort of developed this concept called the counterterrorism war paradigm, which, sort of looking at the way a government articulates, perceives and articulates the dangers that it faces, particularly when these dangers are coming from non-state groups, and also the kind of policies that get instituted in the name of self-defense. And in the case of the United States, it was torture. It was torture, kidnapping, forced disappearance, and then sort of expanding to targeted killing, were policies that defined the war on terror, and are flagrantly illegal, and yet there was no accountability for them. And so they raise these kinds of questions that I think we can also apply to trying to understand and assess what's going on in Gaza. But another wait, am I frozen? Am I okay? Sorry, everybody looked very still. So another sort of paradigm that to understand sort of what's happening or what's not happening now is the concept that Stan Cohen had developed, states of denial, and it's something that I in my sociology of human rights class I am teaching that now, and I found it very sort of relevant to understand, particularly how states, Cohen means states of denial to include individual and collective things, but he also talks about states of denial. And, in the vein of what Ori was talking about, we can see these, the phenomenon of the states of denial as, knowing and not knowing about suffering and atrocities in Gaza. And I've been particularly interested in understanding, and it's something that I'm going to be pursuing in the coming months, how and why states, and particularly the United States, Germany, and other Western governments, as well as international institutions like the International Criminal Court. All of these entities are obligated to abide by and enforce international law, but they've failed to not only to act, but they've failed to acknowledge reality itself. And so what we're seeing, I think, is that these states of denial take, several forms, including misinterpreting what is happening in Gaza as a legitimate prerogative of Israeli self-defense. And I'm happy to discuss that during the question and answer, because Gaza remains occupied, or intentionally opting to disbelieve empirical evidence of gross crimes, and particularly for the United States, sustaining policy traditions that disregard Palestinian national and human rights. And that disregard in and of itself is, a violation of international law. And so I see this, and I see sociology being very useful, because we are facing something, the violence that's going on in Gaza now is unprecedented in certain ways. I mean, it's the most intensive bombing that has occurred anywhere in terms of speed, scope, and intensity since World War II. But it's also, it's a question of international law itself and the international community are in a sense being tested by these circumstances, and whether or not, international law, it is sort of any principles of humanitarianism, what will be the state of just commitments to humanitarian norms in the after this. And I think it's always, when the war on terror started, people were saying, oh, have we come to the end of human rights? And I think was a very good question. And I think that question has not yet been answered, but it is something that sociologists in particular are well suited to probing and analyzing what's going on. And I would just say, just to conclude, I mean, the unfolding developments that are occurring. I mean, one thing that just has been reported in the last couple of days is what Egypt is doing. Egypt is building a kind of enwalled space, where if Palestinians are actually pushed out of Gaza, to prevent them from accessing anything beyond, the northern Sinai, the space itself looks like a freight train. And one can just think, are Palestinians going to be on a freight train to nowhere forever if this is actually what happens to, the population that's currently crammed in Rafah? So, it's a deeply, sort of tragic and enraging situation. But I often find that, find solace from the tools and resources that I have and we have as sociologists. So I'll leave it there, and then we can open it up for discussion.
Awesome. Thank you both. I will stop recording so that folks feel comfortable jumping in.